The Earth Day 2025 t-shirt is now available at www.horses.land. In 1992, 4 hunters discovered a decomposing human body in the Alaskan wilderness. This body was Chris McCandless, a 24-year-old who had abandoned all of his possessions and hiked into the Yukon with little more than a rifle and some books. McCandless was an intelligent, hard-working young man who came from an affluent family and graduated college with high marks. All of the opportunities of the world were surely within reach, and yet his life ended alone, starving to death in the Alaskan countryside. The story of McCandless became an article, a best-selling novel, and eventually a movie. The tale ignited a firestorm of critique, comment, and speculation, much of which still rages on today. Who was Chris McCandless? Why did he march headstrong into the wilderness? What fate came upon him? Thankfully, these answers are relatively easy to find. They have been hidden behind public opinion and a dark family secret, but the truth about Chris is within reach. On his journey, all the way up to his last day on Earth, the young man recorded everything in a personal journal. In 1993, author John Krakauer published a short editorial in Outside magazine about Chris McCandless called Death of an Innocent. It received such widespread attention and acclaim that Krakauer soon expanded it into a book called Into the
guys. Thanks for joining.
That novel then spawned a movie, some TV documentaries, and another book. This second book was written by Chris's sister and describes the tumultuous home life which propelled Chris to his Alaskan voyage. By pulling from all of these sources, we can earn a holistic, earnest understanding of Chris McCandless. Chris was born into an upper-class family in Inglewood, California, but eventually attended Emory University in Atlanta. Immediately upon graduating, Chris mailed his parents his final grades, which were spectacular. Indeed, he'd always been a brilliant, intelligent, and hard-working student. McCandless had all of the advantages a person could be born with, and a work ethic to make good upon these promises. At first glance, all signs may have been pointing towards a successful, fruitful life. But Chris's graduation came and went, and by August, his parents had not heard a word from their son. Worried about his safety and whereabouts, the parents traveled to Atlanta. When they arrived at Chris's apartment, they found a for rent sign on the window. In fact, Chris had actually vanished from the apartment 5 weeks earlier. He had instructed the post office to hold his mail rather than forward it anywhere so that his parents would have no idea as to his destination. So it was early July when, full of the rebellion of youth and unshackled by the demands of academia, Chris McCandless donated all of his remaining college fund to the charity Oxfam. He informally changed his name to the moniker Alexander Supertramp. With this new identity, Chris drove his yellow Datsun west from Atlanta and eventually thousands of miles away
it's at your future. Welcome. Thanks for coming.
Area in Arizona. Chris steered the car off-road and drove 2 miles to the lake's southern shore. There he pitched his tent and thus began the odyssey that would become both his life and his death. Admittedly, the earliest days of Chris's adventure were marked by folly.
It's fine. Actually, it's fine. Thanks for coming. I appreciate the 1%.
The rainwater
I hope you enjoyed the live.
Higher parts of the park, quickly flooding Chris's campsite. The rain did not destroy his car, but it had soaked the engine. After the flood, when Chris tried to start his Datsun, the engine would not turn
How
over.
are you?
His repeated attempts to start the vehicle drained the battery entirely.
You love Fortnite. I love Fortnite, obviously. I'm playing it while nobody's watching. That's how much I love Fortnite.
A number of problems. Any towing company would need to speak to the park rangers. The authorities would have questions and likely fines for Chris, many of which would probably culminate in contacting his parents. Furthermore, his car was uninsured, his registration had lapsed, and his license was
Add me
expired.
up on Fortnite if
So
you want to
Chris
play with
decided to
me.
just leave the Datsun behind.
The name is Tyron
It
GG.
was another
Tyron
material possession which he could
G.
never
Add me up if
check.
you want to play with me.
He removed its plates, buried them, and left his car under a
Yeah,
tarp.
we can play together on
The
so
small
fun.
amount of paper currency he had in
I'm okay, I'm good. Oh, do you mean am I good in the game?
By the American West. Without a car, he hitchhiked around the region for 2 months. He met vagabonds and escaped arrests, but primarily reveled in the natural abundance of the area. He made his way to Lake Tahoe, hiked into the Sierra Nevada, and walked along the famous Pacific Crest Trail. Towards the end of July, Chris found himself in Northern California. There, he lived and worked with 6 other travelers for a man named Ernie. As it turned out, Ernie had no intention of paying Chris or the other workers, so McCandless hit the road once again. At the end of October, Chris caught a ride with a trucker who took him all the way to the Colorado River in Arizona. But now, Chris had his sights on a new destination, the Gulf of California in Mexico. Without identification, Chris realized that crossing the border on foot or
Thank you very much, I appreciate it.
Virtually impossible. So McCandless made his most daring decision yet. With the little money he'd earned from odd jobs here and there, Chris bought a second-hand canoe. He would paddle 400 miles down the Colorado River to cross the border and land in Mexico.
I'm not really chatting much today. I'm enjoying this audio playing.
Well.
So I'm not really chatting much.
On the river through the desert, occasionally stopping to send postcards.
I usually chat
on his journeys or to resupply with food and water. When his canoe reached
the
on the Mexican border, he snuck into the country by paddling through the dam's floodgates. The plan worked, and he recorded in his journal. Alex looks quickly around for signs of trouble, but his entry of Mexico is either unnoticed or ignored. Alexander is jubilant. But after the dam, Chris found the river turning into a labyrinthian system of canals, channels, and unmaintained waterways. After attempting with only moderate success to navigate this maze, Chris encountered some Mexican officials. They provided directions to the Gulf of California, but perhaps owing to a language barrier, the directions were quite poor, and Chris soon found himself lost once again. Chris carried his canoe across land for 3 days before meeting some duck hunters. They told him he was once again headed in the wrong direction, but offered to drive him and the canoe in their pickup truck to the coast. In Chris's journal, he recognized this as a, quote, miracle. Sure enough, the hunters dropped Chris at a fishing village on the Gulf of California. There, Chris slowed down his adventure for a while. He canoed in the sea and took photos of wildlife, sunsets, and dunes. During this time, Chris all but abandoned his journal, producing just 100 words over the course of his month on the Gulf. By the end of his time there, Chris had not spoken to or seen another person for 36 days. He survived on a 5-pound bag of rice and marine life foraged from the sea. But as was the trend for McCandless, he once again grew restless. On January 18th, Chris attempted to pass back into the United States without identification, and he was apprehended by immigration authorities. He spent a night in jail, and the police confiscated his .38 caliber Colt Python handgun, but Chris was released the next day. For 6 weeks, Chris roamed across the Southwest. He wandered and hitchhiked from Houston to the Pacific coast. Though Chris's spirits were high, he'd lost 25 pounds and was suffering from malnutrition. Chris's journeys were taking their toll, so he settled down to rest and recuperate in his next semi-permanent residence, Las Vegas. There he got a job at an Italian restaurant, and he entirely stopped his journal entries. We don't know much about the specific circumstances, but McCandless left Las Vegas in May 1991 and arrived at Bullhead City, Arizona in October. Bullhead became perhaps the most permanent home Chris occupied since leaving college. He had a full-time job at McDonald's, he opened a savings account, and he commuted to work on a bicycle. Chris applied to the job with his real name and social security number. He began squatting in an abandoned trailer near the city. The trailer, though empty, was furnished, had electric sockets, and made for a reasonable home for Chris. In the years that followed his death, his managers and co-workers generally spoke highly of Chris McCandless. They said he was a good worker, dependable, and amicable enough. However, they also noted he had an absent, almost spacey affect about him. After clocking out, Chris didn't spend time with his coworkers. Even during idle workday conversations, he simply waxed on and on about nature and his travels, specifically about his newest plan, a journey to Alaska. And indeed, when he left Bullhead, Chris had only one destination in mind. Of course, Chris didn't immediately make it to Alaska. He had very little money, and further, Chris believed that taking a plane up north would be cheating. So he made his way to a place called Slab City in Southern California. Once a Navy base, but long since abandoned, Slab City was, and still is, a grid of concrete foundations in the middle of the desert. It's a sort of makeshift town of vagabonds, anarchists, drifters, and criminals on the run. The slabs were also home to regular swap meets, where denizens and people in the surrounding areas set up booths to sell second-hand goods. McCandless got a job working in one of these booths and did well to ingratiate himself into the community. He became quite close with his employers and their friends, though Chris was still unwavering. Most of his conversation circled endlessly around his Alaskan voyage. Chris was too substantive in these plans. Every morning he trained physically for the perils of the Alaskan wilderness. He studied survival strategies and traded ideas with the denizens of the slabs. And so he soon hitchhiked out of Slab City. Chris's next stop was Carthage, South Dakota. There, McCandless worked as a farmhand. He wasn't particularly skilled on the farm, but Chris was willing to throw himself at grunt work. He was tenacious and was perfectly happy to handle projects that no one else really wanted to do. McCandless spent his days cleaning warehouses, exterminating pests, painting buildings, and pulling weeds. Still, he spent his free time on his Alaskan plans. He continued to study survival. He sought advice from hunters and survivalists in Carthage. Chris had resolved to hunt for his food in Alaska, so he learned everything he could in Carthage about stalking game, butchering animals, and curing meat for preservation. On April 15th, his friends and co-workers on the farm gathered to see Chris on his way. McCandless had a heavy backpack, $1,000 in his boot, and not much else. Chris's plan was to return to Carthage and work at that same farm after he was finished in Alaska. He left his journal and photo album with the farm's owners for safekeeping. But when the farmers hugged him goodbye, something seemed amiss. According to one account, "I noticed he was crying. That frightened me. He wasn't planning on being gone all that long. I figured he wouldn't have been crying unless he intended to take some big risks and knew he might not be coming back. That's when I started having a bad feeling that we wouldn't ever see Chris again." National parks like those in Alaska are constantly coming under threat. Recently, Interior Secretary Doug Burgum directed America's national parks to remain open despite massive budget cuts and layoffs. One way to keep up with our national park system is Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that helps you develop better news space, as staffing shortages could lead to shorter hours and safety risks. Media conglomerates are publishing a Vantage plan that I use. That plan gets you access to all Indians of South Central Alaska. Chris did not believe himself quite prepared for the journey into the wilderness, so he hitched access to all of the features on Ground News. Check it out, support the channel, and start building better news habits. Just 3 days after departing South Dakota, Chris landed at Laird River Hot Springs, the border of the Yukon Territory. Chris did not believe himself quite prepared for the journey into the wilderness, so he hitched a ride once again, this time to the city of Fairbanks. In Fairbanks, Chris spent much of his time in the library. Specifically, he read through a book called Tanana Plant Lore, an ethnobotany of the Dena'ina Indians of south-central Alaska. This is an extensive, dense, scholarly piece which catalogs and explains the Yukon's edible plant species. McCandless purchased a used, semi-automatic 22 caliber rifle with a scope which he planned on using to hunt game. Along with the rifle, Chris secured 400 rounds of hollow point ammunition. Feeling well prepared, Chris set out. He carried a parka, the rifle, a 10-pound bag of rice, 2 sandwiches, some corn chips, and a sizable collection of books. McCandless arrived at the Stampede Trail, a remote, unkept road which leads into Denali National Park and winds through the Alaskan wilderness. Spring had begun to arrive along the trail. Most streams were thawed and flowing. The snowpack had largely melted and plant life was beginning to turn green again. So Chris McCandless began his final journey. According to his journal, on April 29th, McCandless fell through some ice as he walked across frozen beaver ponds. Seems that Chris was largely unharmed and he continued walking down the long Stampede Trail. After 20 miles of hiking, Chris happened upon an old, abandoned bus. This was quite the blessing for McCandless. The bus's former residents had left it stocked with matches, bug spray, a bed, and a stove. Chris was well aware of his good fortune. In his journal, Chris declared this magic bus day. Now, the bus was not his final destination. He planned to simply keep walking west until he hit the Bering Sea. But Chris decided to make use of the bus as a temporary shelter before proceeding onward.
That you
A
can
wave
die.
of snow from the lingering winter came upon the area. According to his journal, Chris was snowed in at the bus and categorized his situation as, quote, disaster. Chris set out to hunt for game, but he was met with repeated misfortune. He failed to shoot a bear. He missed his shot on some ducks. According to his journal, Chris was on his, quote, 4th day of famine when he finally shot and killed a squirrel. But Chris McCandless was smart, capable, and adaptable. The fresh snow continued to melt, and Chris foraged for lingonberries and rose hips. His luck and skill improved with hunting. Over the next 6 weeks, he shot and ate squirrel, grouse, duck, geese, and other small game. That said, stalking for animals and hunting game requires a lot of energy. The snow had thawed, leaving behind a deep, muddy ground which proved physically difficult to walk through. Chris realized that it was unlikely he could eat sufficient nutrients to sustain his body in a 500-mile walk to the Bering Sea. So he changed his plans. After hiking 15 miles from his shelter, he turned around and decided to make the bus his home for the rest of the summer. Perhaps to his chagrin, Chris McCandless wasn't exactly deep in the Yukon. He was 30 miles from a major highway. He was 16 miles from a large tourist attraction in Denali Park and its National Park Service workers. In any case, Alaska is a punishing, unforgiving place. One need not be at the Bering Sea to be in danger, and indeed Chris did not see another human for the rest of his life. So at the end of May, Chris made the bus his home in earnest. There were 4 cabins within a 6-mile range of Chris's location, one of which was well stocked with food and emergency supplies. Chris did not have a map, so he did not know these existed, but even if he did, they would have been of little use. In early April, they had all been vandalized and burgled, leaving the food supplies spoiled. So whether he knew it or not, settling in the bus was a perfectly good decision. Chris wrote a list of short and longer-term chores, including things like making a map, collecting firewood, building a bathtub, and collecting ice for refrigeration. Following this, Chris experienced a string of hunting success. On May 28th, a duck. On June 1st, 5 squirrels. June 3rd, a porcupine, 4 squirrels, and 3 birds. On June 5, he bagged a Canada goose. The pinnacle of his hunting came on June 9th, when he wrote in his journal in all capital letters, "Moose." It was, in fact, a caribou, not a moose. Although overjoyed initially, Chris began to feel a tide of remorse after killing the caribou. It provided hundreds of pounds of meat, but Chris was just one person. McCandless believed it was morally wrong to waste meat that had been killed for food, so he spent days trying to preserve the caribou. He boiled the organs and tried to smoke most of the meat, but his efforts, according to Chris's journal, were unsuccessful. June 14th. Maggots already. Smoking appears ineffective. Don't know. Looks like disaster. I now wish I had never shot the moose. One of the greatest tragedies of my life. Ultimately, most of the meat spoiled, and Chris was forced to leave it in the forest for wolves and scavenging animals. This whole incident inspired a great sadness in Chris, and he lamented and rebuked himself for weeks on end at the animal's death. But in the days that followed, he concluded, quote, "Henceforth will learn to accept my errors, however great they be." Chris continued hunting, foraging, and surviving for another 6 weeks before deciding that his Alaskan odyssey had come to its close. He dubbed it his, quote, "final and greatest adventure." And for reasons
I would
we may
rather
never
listen to
entirely know,
Tyrone singing than
McCandless
this.
was ready to go home.
As a business, messages and conversations never stop. They're everywhere.
I'm sorry,
Keeping
but
up can feel overwhelming.
I'm not going to sing.
Chris
Yes,
patched his jeans,
What was the story
shaved
about
his
Bestie?
face, organized his things, and took a commemorative photo of his ostensible final.
It's about the life and death of a guy called
Have you lost your voice from screaming?
a little bit. The life of
It's a good story.
Chris Macandus. I don't know how to say his last name.
Ask your wife how her lip liner
Day in
is.
the wilderness. On July 3rd, Chris left his bus, intent on rejoining civilization. After 2 days of walking, Chris arrived again at the same series of beaver ponds.
Please.
When he'd seen them in April, the ponds were still frozen from the winter season and had been passable on foot. But now, in July, they had thawed. Instead of walkable sheets of ice, the ponds were now a 3-acre lake. This was seemingly no terrible problem. Chris hiked up a nearby
Please ask
hillside
her how
around
her
the lake
lip
to
liner
cross a
is
river
doing.
on his new route. But the seasons
It's
once
fine.
again revealed the enormity of their changes. When Chris had arrived in April, the river was more of a creek, knee-deep, cold, but easily passable on foot. Now, in July, a combination of spring rain and melted
you wipe
mountain
it off?
glaciers had flooded the river. It was opaque with sediment, hypothermia cold, rushing dangerously fast, and 100 feet wide. The river was too deep to wade. The
What?
current would have simply swept Chris away.
Wipe what off?
Not far from where he was, the river became a cauldron of bubbling white water. To attempt to cross on foot was, even for the most seasoned adventurer, a simple death sentence. Chris McCandless did not know that about
Can she
half
stream
a mile
tomorrow?
from where he stood at the riverbank, there was a
think
disused
she-
geological station. When in use, the station was equipped with a cart and cable, utilized by scientists for crossing the river, and now often used by hunters for that same purpose. If Chris had known of the station, crossing the river would have been a
Was she
very
bored so
simple
streamed that day?
task. But he did not. So in his journal, Chris wrote, "Disaster, rained in, river look impossible, lonely, scared." Chris returned to the bus on July 8th. Although not to his plan, it was a good time to be in the Alaskan countryside. The warm months meant that plant and animal life were both thriving. Getting food wouldn't be too difficult. The weather, likewise, was less dangerous than in other times of the year. It rained and rained through July. During this time, Chris had tremendous success hunting. He killed 35 squirrels, 9 birds, and 2 frogs. He also foraged well, eating wild potatoes, rhubarb, berries, and mushrooms. While certainly not in peak physical condition, he was sustaining himself. He was rail thin and weak, but far from death. However, that suddenly changed. A look at his journal reveals a series of ominous messages. On July 30th, Chris McCandless wrote in all capital letters, "Extremely weak, fault of pot seed, much trouble just to stand up, starving, great jeopardy." There are no journal entries for July 31st or August 1st. On August 2nd, he wrote of, quote, "terrible wind." On August 5th, his 100th day in the Alaskan wild, Chris's journal reads, "In weakest condition of life, death looms as serious threat. Too weak to walk out, have literally become trapped in the wild. No game." On August 12th, Chris desperately went foraging for berries. Before leaving, he tore a page from one of his books and scrawled on it a desperate SOS. "SOS, I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak
I have
to
to
hike
go
out of here.
bestie to
I am
bed
all
by I will
alone. This is
join
no
T hour
joke.
few
In the name
stream.
of God, please remain to save me.
Join me
I'm out
tomorrow. We'll
collecting
play some
berries
games.
close by and shall return this evening. Thank you." Chris did make it back to the bus, where he wrote his very last journal entry. Beautiful blueberries. At some point during the preceding week, Chris tore a page from the memoir of Louis L'Amour. L'Amour had quoted a poem from Robinson Jeffers called "Wise Men in Their Bad Hours."
Hi.
The poem read,
Hi, how are you?
Welcome to Crimson Global Academy.
I don't know. Welcome.
"Death's a fierce
How are you?
meadowlark, but to die having made something more equal to the centuries than muscle and bone is mostly to shed weakness. The mountains are dead stone, the people admire or hate their stature, their insolent quietness. The mountains are not softened or troubled, and a few dead men's thoughts have the same temper." There are many ways to interpret this poem into Chris's life. The title perhaps hints at self-assessment. Maybe McCandless saw himself as a wise man in a bad hour. But the content of the poem is more revealing. It describes the triumph of having done or created something more significant than the simple errands of human existence. It describes, indeed, an ultimate triumph of the natural world. Chris was dying. He knew it and had remarkably come to peace with that fact. He took one final photo, which shows him brutally emaciated but smiling enthusiastically. In the picture, he held a note written on the reverse of Jeffers' poem. It read, "I have had a happy life and thank the Lord. Goodbye, and may God bless all." Chris McCandless then crawled into his sleeping bag and died. Chris was in reasonably good health throughout his trip, even after returning to the bus. Not great, but survivable. However, in a matter of days, he plunged from relative well-being to a death so obvious even he knew it was incoming. After all, a person must be very ill to conclude with no medical knowledge that death is imminent.
Where is everyone tonight? Chris is a trooper. We're having a very slow night.
McCandless?
I'm having a slow night. I just wanna. What cute Chris, guys. What
Chris's
cute
note pins
Chris.
the blame squarely and obviously on potato seeds, reading "fault of pot seeds." While helpful, this diagnosis is decidedly imprecise, so it has produced a number of theories. One of Chris's friends in South Dakota suggested that he may have purchased some potato seeds before going to Alaska with the intention of planting a vegetable garden in the wilderness. The theory goes that he never got around to planting the garden and instead ate the seeds out of desperation. Potato seeds are, in fact, poisonous. When eaten, they can cause vomiting, diarrhea, and headaches. They can increase heart rate and blood pressure to dangerous levels. But to achieve this level of poisoning, Chris would have needed to eat pounds and pounds of the potato seeds. There's no reason to believe Chris carried or ate such an absurd, massive quantity of potato seeds in Alaska. It is possible, but tremendously unlikely. Furthermore, his journal mostly discusses his diet and food. Nowhere in the journal does he mention eating large amounts of potato seeds. Before embarking on the Stampede Trail, Chris intensely studied the book Tenayana Plant Lore. The book discusses a species of wild potato called Hedysarum alpinum, which grows all throughout the region. Indigenous Alaskans harvested, cooked, and consumed these wild potatoes regularly. The springtime is the ideal season for these potatoes, but they become dry and tough during the summer. According to Chris's journal and a photo he took, he ate these potatoes in July. But also in that month, as the potatoes fell out of season, he started to consume the seeds as well. It was in late July when his Fault of Pot Seed journal entry appears. There's another species which grows in Alaska called Hedysarum mackenzie. Although these are wild peas rather than potatoes, the plants are virtually indistinguishable from one another. These wild peas are extremely toxic. Native Alaskans took great care to avoid confusing them with the wild potatoes, likely because they knew of the poison. Other naturalists have documented this phenomenon, noting that Hedysarum mackenzie had almost killed natives who mistakenly ate the plant. As a newcomer to the Alaskan wilderness, it seems likely that Chris McCandless could have misidentified the plant. So this was the theory espoused and accepted by John Krakauer in his original article for Outside Magazine. It became the widely accepted theory among journalists and the general public. But when Krakauer wrote his follow-up book, Into the Wild, he came upon a new idea. As Krakauer notes, it is a strange mistake for Chris to make. For weeks, Chris consumed the potato seeds without mistaking them for peas. Both species grow in the same area, and it is almost certain McCandless came upon each in his foraging. Furthermore, the page in Tenayana Plant Lore which discusses the toxic peas is literally the very next page after the one detailing the potato seeds. The book indeed makes a special note of the minute differences between the potato seeds and the toxic peas. It was a book Chris studied quite intensely, so it seems unlikely that he would have somehow just entirely skipped this section. Krakauer believes it was not the wild peas, but in fact the wild potato seeds that killed Chris. At first glance, this is a strange theory. Tenayana Plant Lore does not describe the potato seeds as toxic. Furthermore, as Krakauer notes, no scientific, botanical, or medical literature has ever described these potato seeds as being poisonous. So where did Krakauer get this theory? Like many of its relatives, this species of potato seed produces strong concentrations of usually toxic chemical compounds called alkaloids. These alkaloids coat the seeds to prevent animals from eating them in the late summer. If ingested, the potato seeds' alkaloids would produce a number of effects, but would not immediately kill a person. Instead, this particular toxin has the dangerous effect of preventing the body from turning food into storable, usable energy. It basically makes a person starve no matter how much food they eat. If an animal or a person is already malnourished, these toxins affect the body faster and more intensely. When Krakauer had these potato seeds tested for this specific alkaloid, his theory was all but confirmed. They were indeed present. So the most likely theory is just that. Chris McCandless died from eating potato seeds during the wrong time of the year. But perhaps more truly, he died from the sheer, unrelenting, and labyrinthian power of the natural world. We might be tempted to say that if Chris had studied harder or learned more, he would have known better. But the presence of alkaloids in those seeds is so profoundly exact and niche that, as Krakauer notes, even an experienced botanist could have made the same mistake. So we have the story of Chris McCandless, but it is a story which can be interpreted many ways, which can be and has been used to paint a diverse range of pictures of the young vagabond. Some will derisively say he was just an arrogant young man suffering from a fatal case of affluenza. Others may be more reductive and call him simply stupid. But if there is one thing we can be certain of people, it is that they are not characters or caricatures. People are products of environments, moved by an infinitely complex hurricane of emotions, thoughts, qualities, and events. Chris McCandless was no exception.
What would you say to somebody that hasn't tried therapy before?
Just ask yourself if what you're doing in your life right now is working. If you
Given the fact that I, of course, never truly knew Chris McCandless, the best I can do in estimating his character is just that, an estimation. But much of his life is in the public record: journal entries, deeds, relationships, family history. So I think this estimation is a relatively decent one. McCandless was born into a wealthy family. His father, Walt, was a successful aerospace engineer and consultant. The McCandless family lived in an upper-middle-class suburb in Virginia, where they seemed to exist as a utopian nuclear family. But this was a carefully crafted illusion, and in fact the family was racked by nightmarish turmoil. But that is a topic we will return to shortly. Throughout his schooling days and college career, McCandless was an outstanding student. He was extremely intelligent, as many people who encountered him on his travels would later remark. But still, Chris seemed to resent his privileged upbringing. He lived a rather Spartan life at college. His room was furnished with a mattress on the floor, a few milk crates, and a single table. You see, he had a strong repulsion to material goods and luxuries, despite, or probably because of, his upbringing. After graduating college, he donated his remaining college fund to Oxfam, a charity dedicated to fighting hunger. When his parents attempted to buy Chris a new car as a graduation present, McCandless was incensed. He had a decade-old Datsun with 128,000 miles on it, which he insisted was a perfect car. He wrote in a letter to his sister, "I can't believe they'd try and buy me a car. I've told them 1,000,000 times that I have the best car in the world, a car that has spanned the continent from Miami to Alaska, a car that has in all those thousands of miles not given me a single problem, a car that I will never trade in, a car that I am very strongly attached to. Yet they ignore what I say and think I'd actually accept a new car from them. I'm going to have to be real careful not to accept any gifts from them in the future because they will think they have bought my respect." Clearly, Chris loved his Datsun, but I think it's fair to say the rejection of a new car was more than the shabby temper tantrum of an affluent young man. The prospect of a new car seemed to strike Chris as emblematic of a larger, more grotesque problem with his family and the culture of material possessions. It was precisely this culture which Chris endeavored to reject. It is tempting and perhaps not entirely misguided to say Chris McCandless was ungrateful and arrogant. He was born with all of the advantages and opportunities a person could ever hope for, and simultaneously happy to cast them aside entirely. It's difficult to reckon with the idea of someone being born with all of these advantages and rejecting them. For those in life who were born into any iota of struggle, such a decision may be somewhere between ludicrous and offensive. But at least he truly rejected those things. Many people posture with this rejection while keeping a safety net around, acting one way for the sake of fashion or perception, but existing more truthfully in another. Chris did not write to his parents for money. In moments of emergency, he did not seek refuge in his family's status. He did not bank on some existential backup plan. At the very harshest, Chris's rejection of his background could be cast as unreasonable, but certainly this rejection was whole and it was truthful. McCandless was a kind young man. He was courteous, and despite leaning on the deeds of strangers as he hitchhiked, Chris repeatedly refused favors and handouts. He developed deep relationships with the people he met, often communicating for years via post after leaving them behind for his next destination. Chris could be spacey and distant, but this was displayed alongside a tendency for gregariousness. A friend of Chris's from Slab City told Krakauer, he had a good time when he was around people, a real good time. At the swap meet, he'd talk and talk and talk to everybody who came by. He must have met 6 or 7 dozen people in Nyland, and he was friendly with every one of them. He needed his solitude at times, but he wasn't a hermit. He did a lot of socializing. Sometimes I think it was like he was storing up company for the times when he knew nobody would be around. Chris, too, was hard-working. At the various odd jobs he took on his travels, Chris's employers generally regarded him as reliable and not afraid of getting his hands dirty. While he was not talented at each temporary vocation, he was dependable and put forth genuine effort. One of his temporary employers said of Chris, "I've given jobs to lots of hitchhikers over the years. Most of them weren't much good, didn't really want to work. It was a different story with Chris. He was the hardest worker I've ever seen. Didn't matter what it was, he'd do it. Hard physical labor, mucking rotten grain and dead rats out of the bottom of the hole. Jobs where you just get so damn dirty, you couldn't even tell what you looked like at the end of the day. He never quit in the middle of something. If he started a job, he'd finish it. It was almost like a moral thing for him. He was what you'd call extremely ethical. He set pretty high standards for himself." But beyond these very palatable qualities, Chris McCandless overflowed with intensity. He was stubborn and, like many young people, tremendously idealistic. Chris admired and took inspiration from ascetic and transcendental authors, poring over their works and emulating the qualities of self-reliance, anti-materialism, and good, hard work. With this in mind, we can know that Chris's venture into Alaska was not one taken lightly. He was intelligent and well-read and reasonably down to earth. As Krakauer notes, Chris did not anticipate the Yukon as being some utopian wilderness which would accommodate him with ease. Quite the opposite. He knew that it would bring pain, struggle, and hardship. This is exactly what Chris sought for. We must too consider that Chris was in fact very ambitious, but he possessed a unique sort of ambition, not chained to career and material things. It was not that Chris took his advantages for granted or failed to see their significance. More accurately, Chris's desires in life were drastically misaligned with these advantages. He had been equipped at birth prodigiously, sure, but equipped for a life he had no interest in leading. He was given tools for a job entirely separate from the one he hoped to accomplish.
If you manage a team of shift-based workers, then you need RotaCloud. RotaCloud is an all-in...
Oh, you cannot just enjoy video on YouTube
Generally,
without
the professional
ads.
world provides guardrails which prevent young people from doing anything too self-destructive in the aims of their ambition. A first-year banker cannot ruin a company. An early career lawyer cannot spring mass murderers from jail. The entry-level tradesman is generally not tasked with constructing a palace from scratch. But because Chris's ambitions were so far from the monorail of our society, he did not have these aforementioned safeties. Our systems do not protect the young adventurer in the way they do a young banker, lawyer, or tradesman. So Chris was able to run full steam ahead, carrying with him the ignorance and folly of youth. It would also be tempting and arguable to say that Chris was just arrogant. We could say he was clearly unprepared for this Alaskan adventure, and as a consequence of hubris, he died in the wilderness. I think this is a strange combination of correct and misguided. In my experience, youth and arrogance are part and parcel. Where there is youth, unlearned and unaffected by the realities of the world, there is too some form of arrogance. I don't think this is always bad. Arrogance can bring to pass realities that may have been otherwise extinguished by cowardice or worry. But the binary relationship of youth and arrogance is almost universally true in one shade or another. We must not hold this too severely in case against anyone, including Chris McCandless. Chris was also in many ways very successful in Alaska. He survived for 113 days, equipped with nothing but his own abilities and knowledge. It was likely only owing to an unknown, unpublished factoid that he died. Aside from this one, unfortunately fatal, mistake, Chris did survive in Alaska with relative success. I don't generally like to wade into analysis of contemporary media, but here it does prove a point very well. In the modern television program alone, qualified and often expert survivalists are sent into the wilderness. They are allowed to take with them a number of critical tools for survival, and the longest person to stay is given a massive cash prize. Of these dozens and dozens of fully qualified contestants, all of whom are experienced and equipped with a buffet of survival tools, the longest remaining entrant stayed in the wilderness for 100 days, about 2 weeks shorter than McCandless. Other contestants have won the competition after as little as 40 days. This may not be a perfect comparison, but it does illustrate the point. Chris McCandless was 22 years old. He had no incentive other than his own desires. We could be harsh and say he was ill-equipped, inexperienced, or underprepared, but still, he was more successful than many contemporary experts have been in this sort of endeavor. At this point, we have a pretty good estimation of Chris McCandless as a person. But there is still one massive piece missing from this puzzle. We are all products of our environments. Chris was no exception, and his environment reveals absolute mountains about McCandless himself and his motivations.
Guys, the next part might be a little bit heavy for anybody.
Chris McCandless had a number of influences. As mentioned, his heroes were authors like Tolstoy and Thoreau, these affluent men who rejected luxury in favor of hardship and monkish existences. Chris McCandless was indeed born into a sort of luxury, a house of prosperity, but it was exactly this background which propelled him to reject material things, to venture into Alaska. In 2015, Chris's sister, Corinne McCandless, published the book The Wild Truth. In this work, Corinne tells a story which is notably absent from Krakauer's famous book, The Abuse-Laden Childhood of Chris McCandless. Corinne relayed this information to Krakauer when he was researching for Into the Wild, but she did not give her blessing for him to include the material. It was a story she later said that she wanted to tell on her own. I think this is a reasonable desire. Indeed, when Corinne published her book, Krakauer publicly applauded the work. In any case, this material radically and certainly changes the story of Chris McCandless. Chris and Corinne's parents were Billy and Walt McCandless. When Walt met Billy, he was already married to a woman named Marcia. Walt also had a child with Marcia. The married Walt told Billy he would be leaving his wife, but this wasn't true. In reality, Marcia had been trying to leave Walt for some time, but Walt was an alcoholic, abusive husband. The physical abuse was tremendous. At one point, he fractured a vertebrae in Marcia's back, prompting their 13-year-old son to call the police. Billy eventually became pregnant with Chris, but instead of leaving Marcia, Walt entered into a bigamous relationship. For years, he was married to both Billy and Marcia at the same time, before Marcia eventually fled the abusive home. The entirety of this did little to quell Walt's fury. Throughout Chris and Corinne's childhood, Walt beat Billy and their children relentlessly. He was a violent alcoholic who lorded over the family home with an iron fist. The parents got into yelling, violent arguments. Walt hurled insults at Billy, chased her around the home, and threw her into walls. On one occasion, he attempted to choke Billy to death. Billy screamed to the children, begging for help. In response, Walt beckoned the children into the room so they could see, quote, "what your mother is making me do." Each day after arriving home from work, Walt screamed a barrage of orders to the children and admonished Billy if she was not dressed properly. He required she wear a short skirt, high heels, and have her hair and makeup pin precise. Walt constantly berated Billy. He told her she would be nothing without him. He reminded her that he was a genius, while she didn't even have a college education. According to Corinne's book, Walt screamed things like, quote, "I put the first American spacecraft on the moon. You've never done anything important." After years of abuse, Chris and Corinne learned to hide at the sight of their father's car arriving home. If Chris or Corinne missed their chores or teased one another, the children were made to choose the weapon of discipline. They routinely combed through Walt's collection of belts, looking for the one which would hurt the least. But even this choice was a lie. If Chris or Corinne selected the wrong belt, Walt would make them pick another. Once a weapon had been selected, Walt spanked the children with the leather belt in a drunken rage. Corinne described him as having a, quote, terrifying smile like an addict in the climax of a high. After high school graduation, Chris told his father that he wanted to travel through the summer. Chris said he was tired of the structure of life, that he had grown weary of everything being predetermined and set out for him. Chris wanted to get out and enjoy the world for a few weeks. Walt was furious. He insisted that Chris give a moment-by-moment itinerary for his plans. He told Chris that he was irresponsible and stupid, despite the son having been a straight-A student, a star athlete, and having worked 2 jobs all the while. As the shouting match concluded, Chris turned his back to leave. Walt rushed forward and punched Chris right in the center of his spine. As is often the case, this abuse happened behind a carefully constructed facade of perfection. After beating the children, Walt required a family supper where they discussed his work, school, family vacations, or anything else except the violent abuse. Walt was careful to avoid leaving visible marks on his children. He paraded his perfect family around at Sunday church services and community events. If the children ever said anything to him about the abuse, Walt said they were just being dramatic and that they needed to be more grateful for the advantages they had, for the money he brought to the family. Meanwhile, Billy directly blamed Chris for all of this abuse. She regularly reminded Chris that when she got pregnant with him, that alone had doomed her and the family to all of this suffering. This logic is, of course, mortally flawed, but drilled into the head of a youth, it would certainly be taken as fact. The timbre only cooled consistently on one type of occasion: family camping trips. The parents never fought on these trips. The abuse halted. The parents shifted their attention to the activity at hand. They taught their children how to identify trails, how to lace up hiking boots, what kind of clothing to wear, which plants were safe to touch, and how to build a fire. Walt sang songs. He entertained the children with stories about space aliens and taught Chris how to roast marshmallows. In her book, Corinne also discusses how Chris coped with his father's abuse. After being paraded around at church or local events, forced to ignore the sufferings at home, the siblings often walked back to their house. Chris took Corinne on long detours through the woods where he reveled in the natural surroundings. Corinne writes, Chris loved to look at every type of plant, animal, and bug he hadn't seen before on the trail and point out those he did recognize. He enjoyed walking along small streams, listening to the water as it traveled and searching for eddies where we could watch the minnows scurry amongst the rocks. On one Shenandoah trip, while we were resting at a waterfall, eating our chocolate-covered granola bars and watching the water pummel the rocks below, he said, "See, Corinne, that's the purity of nature. It may be harsh in its honesty, but it never lies to you." Walt McCandless has claimed that Corinne is just lying about the abuse, that the stories are entirely fictional. I do not believe him. The viewer of this video can use their own discretion. Chris's life of privilege and luxury did not, to him, represent opportunity, but instead pain. It seems as if he reached a breaking point where he no longer found his domestic battle to be worth fighting. Instead, he simply wanted to get away. Most specifically, he yearned for the wilderness, for the only place he was ever truly happy. Much has been suggested about Chris McCandless. The most classic of these ideas has been to paint Chris's journey as one of hubris. He was an arrogant young man who did not understand nature or his own limits, and so he died in Alaska. I think this interpretation is a compound sort of failure, which does not accurately describe the protagonist of the story nor the concrete events. Chris did very well in Alaska. He survived for a very long time. As a person, it may be true that he was arrogant, but this was not a defining trait of Chris McCandless. Rather, he had an unfortunate and ultimately fatal combination of qualities. A sense of ambition unguarded by the material world, an arrogance found so commonplace in youth that it is almost unremarkable, and a childhood which poisoned his impression of contemporary society. The story and life of Chris McCandless is rife with contradictions. Chris was running from something, but he was too running towards something. He disdained the people who knew him the best, but collected a veritable family on his travels. He was prepared and skilled in survival, but consciously chose to be unequipped in the most elementary ways. A simple map would have saved his life. Years after Chris's death, his former neighbor at the trailer park described McCandless. He seemed like a kid who was looking for something, just didn't know what it was. I don't think Chris McCandless wanted to die in Alaska, but I do believe he was prepared to die. He shouldered a mortal risk which was no stranger to him. It was a risk he understood quite deeply, and the consequence of his death was one that he accepted and even embraced in his final days. Nature was his closest companion in life, and so when it came to him as death, perhaps McCandless had found what he was searching for. Perhaps he had found peace.
I love that story. I love that story.
This is an ad about client acquisition for your
Welcome,
marketing
Abdul
agency,
Rahman.
coaching, consulting,
Welcome.
or course selling business. And
This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. It is common to imagine cannibalism as the purview of jungle-dwelling tribes in South America or other remote places in the global South. Yet virtually every continent
We're gonna check out the story of Vincent van Gogh.
Vincent Willem van Gogh, or Van Gogh as he is known on this side of the Atlantic, is perhaps the modern archetype of a tortured artist. This label is reasonably accurate. He was a genius, but Vincent was marked by unending battles with mental illness. His life is relatively well understood and very well documented, as are many of the sufferings contained within it. But it is in his death where mystery abounds. One afternoon, Vincent left his residence to go paint alone in a field. He returned that evening with a bullet in his stomach. For generations, his death has been ruled a suicide, despite a number of suspicious and unlikely circumstances. In fact, many pieces of evidence suggest that it was certainly not Vincent who fired that bullet. Recent research has called the suicide narrative into severe question. So severe, in fact, that we are left with an entirely new question. Who really killed Van Gogh? The first step in arriving at an answer is, however, to understand the suicide theory, and to understand why history has been so ready to accept it as fact. Throughout his life, Vincent van Gogh suffered greatly from a litany of mental conditions. His earliest struggles began at the age of 18 when he was working as an apprentice art dealer. His first relationship, or rather romantic infatuation, concluded in a great disappointment. Vincent took this disappointment quite harshly and quickly fell into a deep depression. Eventually, Van Gogh lost all interest in his job as an art dealer. This was partially motivated by a hatred for its overtly financial frequencies, as well as his own internal and ongoing depression. For several months he remained quite gloomy and isolated before eventually turning his thoughts to religion. Vincent quickly found some amount of guidance or even salvation from his depression within the church. He pursued this hotly, diving passionately into his religious studies. The young man devoted his next 4 years to becoming a preacher, which he saw as his new calling in life. However, Van Gogh ultimately failed to earn a formal theology degree. Instead, he worked for the church as an evangelist in a small, impoverished mining town. There, he donated virtually all of his belongings and earnings. He was destitute by choice. Vincent's superiors saw his extreme charity as disgraceful. His poverty, they claimed, lacked the dignity required for ecclesiastical work. Van Gogh refused this thinking and continued with his charity, so he was soon dismissed entirely by the church. Once again, he plunged into a dark depression. By his own admission, Vincent's greatest fear was that he would never find a way to meaningfully contribute to the world. In these years, it seemed like this fear was being very much realized. Vincent abandoned his religious ideals altogether and at the age of 27 began passionately pursuing a career as an artist. By all accounts, this was a failing enterprise, kept afloat only by the moral and financial support of his brother Theo, who was an art dealer in Paris. During these years, Van Gogh experienced another failed romance. Following this, he lived with a local prostitute and her children for over a year. His family alienated him for this decision, and Vincent's father threatened to put him into an asylum. In response, Vincent returned to live with his parents. In 1885, his father died suddenly, but Van Gogh's dedication to artistic practice only.
Yeah, AI chatbots are actually super exciting, but I'm sorry, we'd rather not introduce them. We don't have any
strengthened. Vincent was passionate and dedicated. He was single-minded in his pursuit of artistic achievement, perhaps to a fault. Despite never having received formal training or even showing significant artistic promise, Vincent's creative output was astounding. Virtually all that he did was paint and sketch. He produced hundreds and hundreds of works in just a few years. But for all of his tenacity, Vincent had very little to show for himself. So after 6 years of essentially an ever-failing art career, Van Gogh joined his brother Theo in Paris. This was not in the interest of giving up, quite the opposite. Paris seemed like the place to be for an ambitious artist. Yet it was in Paris where Vincent's mental illness manifested with a viciousness he had never experienced. In Paris, Van Gogh had developed a strong fondness for absinthe, which at the time had significant convulsant properties. Today, historians think Vincent's alcoholism could have exacerbated some already present mental illnesses. In Paris, Van Gogh suffered from violent episodes of psychological terror, intense physical pains, and regular lapses of consciousness. He was quarrelsome. Vincent kept Theo awake through long nights with endless arguments about basically minutiae. His mental afflictions meant Vincent was also quick to anger, so he was unwelcome in a number of homes and restaurants around the city. Theo felt his brother a burden, but he remained sympathetic. Theo said in a letter about Vincent, "It seems as if he were two persons, one marvelously gifted, tender and refined, the other egotistic and hard-hearted. They present themselves in turns so that one hears him talk first in one way and then in the other, and always with arguments on both sides. It is a pity that he is his own enemy, for he makes life hard not only for others, but also for himself." It is hard to overstate the importance the two brothers placed on one another and on their relationship. It's not always an easy relationship, but Theo supported Van Gogh wholeheartedly in his work and his life. Theo sympathized with Van Gogh's struggles. He recognized that Vincent was beholden to demons no one could truly understand, and at the time that no one really cared much about. In 1888, Theo thought that Paris was getting the better of Vincent, and so he set up a studio in the south of France in a town called Arles for his brother. Theo convinced the artist Gauguin to join Vincent there to live and work, likely thinking his brother could use a stable and positive influence around him. In Arles, Van Gogh produced some of the most intense paintings of his life. was also there his mental illness reached psychotic dimensions. Vincent abused cognac and absinthe like never before. His mood swung wildly. He oscillated between manic creativity and listless exhaustion, between euphoria and anguish. In his most heightened emotional states on either side of this spectrum, Van Gogh would throw himself completely into his work. Painting was more or less his only treatment. As only the most unfortunate sufferers are, Van Gogh was well aware of his own degrading sanity. He wrote in a letter, "I am unable to describe exactly what is the matter with me. Now and then there are horrible fits of anxiety, apparently without cause, or otherwise a feeling of emptiness and fatigue in the head, and at times I have attacks of melancholy and of atrocious remorse." In Arles, Gauguin was quickly reaching his limits with Vincent. After 2 months of constant arguing with Van Gogh, Gauguin decided to leave. On Christmas Eve of 1888, Vincent threw a glass of absinthe in Gauguin's face. Van Gogh was escorted home and put to bed by a companion. Later in the evening, Gauguin left the house again. Van Gogh followed him and attacked the artist with a razor. Gauguin was able to repel Vincent, and Van Gogh went back to their home. At the house, he cut off a piece of his left earlobe, presented it to his then favorite prostitute. Police were alerted. Found Van Gogh unconscious at his house. Van Gogh was hospitalized, where he fell into a psychotic state of agitation, hallucination, and delusion. Vincent was put into solitary confinement for 3 days. After these days, he retained no memory of the attack on Gauguin or the self-mutilation. Today, some scholars believe Van Gogh had been experiencing auditory hallucinations, which commanded him to attack Gauguin and then cut off his own ear. Van Gogh remained hospitalized for several weeks. During this time, he continued to experience a series of psychotic episodes, delusions, and further hallucinations. In April of 1890, Van Gogh experienced the worst psychotic break of his life. He described horrifying religious hallucinations and had intense, violent impulses. For some time, Vincent simply was not of this world. However, less than a month later, his physician declared him cured and discharged Van Gogh from the hospital. There was, and is, very little evidence to suggest that Vincent was even remotely suitable for release. Van Gogh moved north of Paris to Auvers-sur-Oise, where he would spend the final 10 weeks of his life. In this town, Vincent stayed at the relatively quiet Ravoux Inn. There, things seemed to move in a positive direction. He abstained from drinking and remained free from seizures and psychotic episodes. His art was beginning to gain recognition. Vincent had even sold a painting. Van Gogh worked at an intense pace, producing 100 works in just 70 days. At the inn, Vincent enjoyed time alone in the nearby wheat fields. There he would create some of his most incredible landscape work and seemingly experience something quite close to peace. For the first time, perhaps ever, it seemed Vincent had found respite from his pain.
Step into Wix Studio, the platform for agencies and enterprises. Kick off projects.
On Sunday, July 27th, Vincent left the inn after lunch to go paint in those same wheat fields. That evening, he returned to the Ravoux Inn. The innkeeper, Gustave, saw Van Gogh approach on the dark street. However, he did not carry with him his easel or canvas, nor his paints. Vincent was holding his stomach and limping weakly. Van Gogh passed by Gustave without a word. This was uncharacteristic of the artist. The innkeeper was worried about Vincent's behavior, so Gustave listened from the bottom of the stairs that led to the artist's attic room. After hearing loud, pained moaning, Gustave climbed the stairs and found Vincent curled up weakly on his bed. Gustave asked what was wrong, to which Vincent replied only, "I have wounded myself." For 2 days, Van Gogh received treatment at the inn, but he was slowly and painfully dying. At midnight, on July 29th, Vincent was cradled in his brother's arms. Theo was, and had always been, Vincent's only true friend. He was the one man who had escorted Vincent through his sufferings with kindness and sympathy. As Vincent lied dying in his brother's arms, Theo still did not let go. And so Vincent spoke his final words. "I want to die like this." For 30 minutes, Van Gogh sat with his mouth agape, gasping for air as the wound sucked the final moments of life from his body. He was limp in Theo's arms. Shortly after 1 a.m., with his mouth open and his eyes wide, Van Gogh's heart stopped. The following day, Theo wrote to their mother. Life was such a burden to him. He has found the rest he longed for. These are the events that we know happened. The typical line of thought, of conclusion, and even of Vincent's own words was a self-inflicted gunshot. For ages this was believed to be true, but now it seems significantly less likely. Nobody knows what happened in the field where Van Gogh painted on July 27th. The police briefly investigated but produced no witnesses to Vincent's activities on the day. No one could ever figure out exactly where or when the incident occurred. No one in the small village heard a gunshot that day. Vincent's easel, paints, and canvas were never found. The gun likewise disappeared. When he was found by the innkeeper, Van Gogh demanded medical attention himself. A doctor was summoned, and Vincent gave no explanation for where he had gotten a gun or why he had wanted to kill himself. When the police asked Vincent if he had shot himself, he responded only, "Yes, I believe so." They reminded him that suicide was a crime, and with an unprompted intensity, Vincent declared, "I acted alone. Do not accuse anyone." One of the innkeepers later assembled the following story based on Vincent's words and conversations overheard at his bedside. During the afternoon, in the deep path that lies along the wall of the chateau, Vincent shot himself and fainted. The coolness of the night revived him. On all fours, he looked for the gun to finish himself off, but he could not find it. Vincent then got up and climbed down the hillside to return to our house. This answers very few of the questions surrounding his death, questions which today remain unanswered. How could the gun have fallen so far from his hands that he couldn't find it? Why didn't anyone else find the gun that day or the next? What about the missing easel, canvas, and paints? When Vincent arrived at the inn, he was not dripping blood along his path, nor were there signs of blood on his clothes. How could Vincent have laid, allegedly with a gunshot wound, for several hours and produced so little blood? There was a steep wooden slope between the inn and the fields. It would have taken significant physical effort to walk on this slope. If Vincent was wounded and barely conscious, surely he wouldn't have been able to make this journey. Furthermore, where and when did Vincent get a gun? Why did he shoot himself? If Van Gogh had meant to shoot himself in the heart, he had missed wildly. Based on his wound, the barrel of the gun had been held below his heart and pointed downward. A group of researchers actually recreated the gunshot and found a number of problems, but we'll talk about those in great detail later. In fairness, Vincent had thought about suicide before. Indeed, he had threatened it outright many years prior. But his conclusions were always, invariably, against the idea. Time and time again, he categorized suicide as weak and terrible. Vincent believed suicide to be a crime against art itself. This is significant because Vincent had passionately, obsessively dedicated his life to art. In one letter, Vincent described himself as someone who has come too close to suicide to ever really do it. "I am trying to recover," he wrote, "like someone who is meant to commit suicide but then makes for the bank because he finds the water too cold." It's worth noting that every time the idea of suicide came into Vincent's mind, it approached in the same form: drowning. Every time he had thought of the act, he had threatened drowning. This happened time and time again, even once saying the only type of suicide he could understand was drowning. There was a river near the inn. Surely if Vincent had resolved to suicide, he would have drowned himself in that river. There was also a serious lack of preparation for death on the part of Vincent. His final letters to Theo had been boisterous. He had written plans for the future, including a request for more paint. His last paintings were vibrant depictions of country life. Vincent was obsessed his whole life with writing letters. He spent much of his time expressing his every action in writing, but there was no suicide note in his room.
Do you want your videos to look like this? Well, in just 14 days,
you cannot watch a video on YouTube without ads, man.
There also exists a litany of problems with the gun itself. It's said that Vincent shot himself with a revolver. At the time, a revolver was still a novelty in the south of France. It would have been worth a significant amount of money. It was not a gun that someone would simply lend away. Indeed, no one in the town recalled seeing Vincent with a gun, and no stores or individuals admitted to selling or giving him the weapon. In later years, claims arose about Vincent borrowing a gun to, quote, scare away crows, or that he had threatened townspeople with a similar gun, or still that he himself had owned the revolver through his whole life. But these are baseless claims. There's absolutely no evidence that any of these things are true. In the days following the incident, locals inventoried every gun, and one was indeed missing. Years later, its owner would claim that Vincent had stolen the gun, but this was never verified in any meaningful way. It's simply a rumor. Furthermore, when the doctor arrived at the inn, Vincent seemed to have no interest in dying. Rather, he screamed and begged for someone to remove the bullet from his body. He desperately wanted surgery. Van Gogh could have been transported to war-trained surgeons 20 miles away in Paris to get medical attention, surgeons who likely would have saved his life. Instead, Vincent's doctor, a Dr. Gachet, refused to perform surgery. Instead, he let Vincent lie in bed, in agony, dying for 30 hours. Moving Van Gogh would have come with risks, but Vincent was dying. The worst outcome of moving him was the same as the already accepted outcome. Yet, he remained in place. While this hints more towards medical negligence than homicide, it is a detail that further obfuscates Vincent's death. There was a story that persisted around town long after Vincent died. The story claimed 2 young boys had accidentally shot Vincent while playing with a gun. The boys had never come forward because they feared being accused of murder. The conclusion was therefore that Van Gogh had protected them in his final act. This would have expressed a sort of generosity that Vincent had indeed displayed throughout his life. This is, of course, just another rumor and should be taken with a grain of salt, but it would answer more questions than the theory of suicide. Admittedly, though, all of this is just conjecture and circumstantial evidence. Nothing I've said entirely rules out suicide. But that is where we arrive at the topic of modern forensics. In 2020, a group of researchers published a study on the death of Vincent van Gogh. In this study, the researchers examined all surviving evidence, circumstantial and physical. They also recreated the gunshot that killed Van Gogh. Working alongside a medical staff, the researchers came to this conclusion. It is therefore our opinion, based on that limited information, that in all medical probability, the cause of death is not a self-inflicted wound by Vincent van Gogh, and thus in all medical probability, a homicide. By his attending physician, Van Gogh's wound was noted to be pea-sized with a red concentric margin surrounded by a bluish-brown ring. The physician did not describe any black gunpowder burns on the skin or clothing around the wound. When Van Gogh died, guns used black powder ammunition. Fired at close range, these guns left powder burns tattooed onto the flesh. If Vincent had shot himself at point-blank range, a powder burn would have been virtually impossible to avoid. You could argue that the physician just omitted the mention of a powder burn at his own discretion. But the examination of powder burns was an essential technique used by police and doctors of Van Gogh's era. If such a burn had existed on Van Gogh, it would have absolutely been recorded. The lack of a powder burn alone makes it extremely unlikely that Van Gogh could have shot himself. In fact, the policeman who examined Vincent's wound personally concluded that the artist was shot from 1 to 2 feet away. But in response, Van Gogh claimed that he shot himself, and so the record reflected his words. In 1960, a French farmer found an old rusted and bent revolver in a wheat field outside of the town where Vincent had died. It was an era-appropriate weapon found vaguely close to the place Van Gogh died. Despite a lack of actual evidence, experts at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam considered it likely to be the gun Vincent used. So the researchers in the 2020 study procured that same gun to recreate Van Gogh's wound. They fired the gun into FBI-grade ballistics gel from a variety of distances. The gel was also covered in cotton fabric to simulate the clothing Van Gogh would have been wearing. As expected, the point-blank firing produced a significant powder burn. 6, 12, and 18-inch distances produced decreasingly present burns, with the burn disappearing entirely at 12 inches. So based on the absence of the powder burn, Van Gogh must have been shot at a distance of at least 12 inches. A person could hold a gun from that distance and shoot themselves. The researchers thus explored this possibility, but quickly eliminated it. Based on the records of Van Gogh's examining physician, the researchers had a good understanding of the bullet's trajectory as it moved through Vincent's body. To create this trajectory and fire the gun from 12 inches away, Vincent would have had to contort his body in a way that was virtually impossible. Put quite simply, given the gun and a will to suicide, Vincent could not have produced the wound that killed him.
Join the action and get a £40 casino bonus when you deposit and play £10. Enjoy top slots.
The unfortunate reality is that none of this proves anything, and nor will it ever. We will always know that Van Gogh died of a gunshot wound, but we will never know who fired that gun. The circumstantial doubts about Van Gogh's death are just that, circumstantial. These unanswered questions cast immense doubt on the idea of suicide, but do not eliminate it entirely. They could all be answered with some varying stretches of the imagination. The forensic study likewise has problems. By the researchers' own admittance, there is only so much evidence available for a 150-year-old case. Most of the facts are eyewitness reports or first-hand accounts that have likely been manipulated by time. To get more substantial information, the body of Van Gogh would need to be exhumed, and even then, it's unlikely there would be any true, final verdict. I also think that Van Gogh's history of mental illness complicates matters. If any action of his seems illogical or unlikely, that could be quite easily explained by his lifelong predisposition for acting irrationally. We can never know what happened in that field. The two options seem to be homicide or suicide. But either of these was a cruelty horrifically and uniquely tailored to Vincent himself. Modern psychologists have provided a variety of diagnoses for Vincent van Gogh. Psychosis, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia have all been suggested. But ultimately, Vincent's afflictions meant much of his life was stolen from him. His actions and his thoughts were touched by monsters, polluted and put out of even his own reach. Vincent was rarely more than a man violently strapped into the passenger seat of his own life. In death, Vincent did not find any more agency nor peace. He was ultimately throttled and thrown into an abyss. Whether by suicide or homicide, we can only be sure that Vincent died as helplessly as he lived. Far more than our eternal unknowing, this is the true tragedy of Vincent van Gogh.
Thank you very much for watching. If you don't know who Vincent van Gogh is, he's I think 17th century artist. He's one of the best artists, painters. If you go online, you'll see a lot of his artwork. People love it. If you go online, you see a lot of his artwork.
Peggy 18.
We're gonna watch
Check out the horse's
another
store at
one named
horses.land. There's a sword, some
Beds
t-shirts,
Do Not
and a
Sing in the
notebook that are all
Caves.
shipping
That's the
now.
title.
Thank you.
Next.
I hope you enjoy
Beds
this
Do
video.
Not Sing. I don't think it has anything to do with beds.
Years ago, one winter, I was living on the south side of Chicago and working in the city's downtown area. As I walked into the underground train station one night, I saw a man sitting on the floor. He was homeless, a fact which is so tragically unremarkable that I may not even need to mention it at all. In front of him, on the ground, there was a long, round, dark object. It was all black as the asphalt above us. Hovering over the man was another individual, dressed in a doctor's uniform, carrying a bag. My best guess was that he was on the way home from his job at some medical facility. The doctor was imploring the man on the ground, who was unresponsive, to go to the emergency room, that if he didn't get to the hospital, he would die. This elicited no verbal response from the man on the ground. In fact, he didn't even move. The doctor gave up pretty quickly. He had a train to catch. And as I got closer, it became more clear what the object on the ground was. Or rather, that it was not an object at all. It was the man's bare leg, rotting and matte black from his ankle to his knee. The leg was so swollen, so ballooned, that it lacked the contours human anatomy should have given it. It looked dry and brittle. I couldn't help but imagine pushing my finger through his limb and feeling it crumble. If I did this, I further imagined I would find some purple-gray liquid that was not at all what a human leg should contain. Of course, I didn't do this. I walked by the man, hypnotized by this rotten limb, not understanding how something so dead could be attached to a living person. The city of Chicago, in all of its intelligence, had deemed this issue to be undeserving of attention. Dozens of passers-by just passed him by. I did the same. American humanity had assembled all of its mental, spiritual, and economic power to create the shining city of Chicago. The city was a metropolis, a beacon of human technological achievement, progress crystallized by concrete and rebar. And yet it all seemed to add up to this. A human rotting on the ground, passed by because we all just had trains to catch. I didn't understand how this could be. I know that this incident in itself is just that, an incident. A specific problem with its own mechanical solutions. But perhaps I am just not a mechanical person. So it began within me a long, slow disillusionment with metropolitan life, and by association, even with the modern notion of progress. I'd like to talk about that now. Henry David Thoreau was a 19th century writer and leader of the Transcendentalist movement. Aside from its being as a religious movement, this school of thought believed in the inherent goodness of nature and humanity. Transcendentalists, though, noted that modern systems and technologies had spoiled this goodness. To be more immediate, Thoreau is famous for his work Walden. In 1845, Thoreau moved to a small, isolated cabin in the forest around Walden Pond, Massachusetts. Thoreau lived there for 2 years, eventually producing the book Walden based on his experiences. For the author, this was an experiment in simple living. He observed that rather than deliberate living, most people simply accepted that life was a series of waking up, working, going to bed, and repeating. He noted that this was not really by any fault of the individual. Thoreau writes, "When we consider what are the true necessities and means of life, it appears as if men had deliberately chosen the common mode of living because they preferred it to any other. Yet they honestly think there is no choice left." People's values were chosen for them by the culture into which they were born. The modern world did not offer sufficient time or space for an individual to arrive at their own conclusions about life. It was financially, materially impossible to engage in this self-examination. a person was just too busy. So instead, the world forced judgments onto a person. It told each individual what was important. And the person, more often than not, accepted those judgments, whether or not they felt any innate attraction to them. The result of this passive value acceptance had been, Thoreau noted, a culture of rampant but somehow passive materialism. Indeed, today we seek happiness in riches because the world has told us that is where happiness is to be found. In reality, we will never find happiness in these things. They are distractions from discovering true internal fulfillment. Thoreau points to a farmer who has inherited a barn, cattle, and farm tools. This circumstance could be celebrated. The farmer now had a means to make a living. But in reality, these things were not gifts to the farmer. They were burdens and they were obligations thrust onto him by powers far outside of his own. Thoreau suggests that if the farmer had been born into the wild, suckled by a wolf, he may have been better off. He may have been free to find his own pasture, his own calling. You see, upkeeping the farm does not just cost the farmer money, it costs toil and trouble, it costs time. Time that could be used to explore what the farmer himself actually wanted and valued. The farm costs life, and so the farmer from birth is born to dig his crops and also his grave. But to abandon these inheritances is equally treacherous. How then would he make a living? As far as I can tell, such is our modern version of humanity. We have all inherited this farm of technology, the crops of our systems, the implements of trade, banking, and commerce. In one breath, we thank the skies for such a prosperous world, while not recognizing that this so-called prosperity is also a vampire. It truly drains our lives. It forces our hand, forces us to exist within its never-ending loop. And just like the farmer, to abandon these things would destroy our civilization. Thoreau notes that most men, even in this comparatively free country, through mere ignorance and mistake, are so occupied with the factitious cares and superfluously coarse labors of life that its finer fruits cannot be plucked by them. Their fingers from excessive toil are too clumsy and tremble too much for that. All of our knowledge and efforts must be thrust into the market, into the modern system of living, so that we simply cannot use any to explore our innermost selves. Even as I type this, the idea of exploring what it means to be alive comes to me as so bizarrely abstract. It is like a distant shout from the outside, barely discernible, more likely attributed to the woes of some events on the street and far easier to simply ignore than examine. In this way, we are pushed to not only ignorance of our existence, but to the ignorance of this ignorance. We just don't know any better. In battle against all of this, Thoreau stripped life back to its most bare essentials. At Walden Pond, he sought to live deliberately. This was to lead life with intention, to arrive at conclusions and judgments independently, and to do things on purpose by your own choosing. Thoreau spent his time at Walden largely in solitude. This word should not be taken to mean just being alone. It is rather to be with. It is a very active engagement with the world around oneself. Thoreau noted that he, in fact, at Walden, quote, had a great deal of company in his house. He said that on his land he had the company of an old settler, of the man who had first dug his home at Walden Pond. He had the company, too, of an invisible old woman who he described as owning a wondrously fragrant herb garden. This woman, Thoreau said, told, quote, the original of every fable and that on which everyone is founded. So Thoreau in his solitude is very much not alone. The past, the present, and the future were all in society at Walden, pouring out in the natural world around him. Thoreau's solitude was not indicated by miles of space, but rather a nearness to himself and to the very fibers of the world, an appreciation for those things which formed and existed infinitely in nature. Solitude can help us break free from unintentional living. When removed from society, a person is too removed from the distractions it presents. While social dynamics are important for social life, they often override things which otherwise would allow us to flourish. In the developed world, we are ostracized, misunderstood, or admonished for not embracing societal norms. And so society at large encourages and even requires oppressive conformity. Solitude frees us from these norms and values which we have passively accepted. It removes the barriers which prohibit us from truly knowing ourselves. When we are not bound by these constructs, we can better find what we individually, authentically, and truly believe to be important. Of course, Thoreau's writing is not so simple, and its context also deserves attention. Thoreau does not declare that all of humankind should return to some primitive pre-industrial society. Indeed, while at Walden, Thoreau wasn't entirely cut off from the world. He recounts dinners with friends, trips to town, and occasional meetings with townspeople. Some people have said this invalidates all that he wrote. I disagree. Walden was not created as a man against nature tale. In the book, which is basically a diary, Thoreau never proclaims himself as being entirely self-sufficient or living off the land. Instead, it is the desire to simplify life that is the driving force behind Walden. It is less of a physical self-reliance that Walden espouses, but instead a spiritual self-reliance. Walden is not an outright rejection of modern society, but a quest to better know oneself so that we can discover which parts of society we are suited to. After all, Thoreau himself went quite happily and even ambitiously back to the civilized world after leaving Walden Pond. Thoreau's idea was not that everyone should follow his lead. Walden was not a guidebook for living nor a copyable roadmap for happiness, as much as it pains me to admit. Instead, it was an exaltation to find your own Walden Pond. In the book, Thoreau writes, "I would not have anyone adopt my mode of living on any account. I desire that there may be as many different persons in the world as possible, but I would have each one be very careful to find out and pursue his own way, not his father's, or his mother's, or his neighbor's instead." There's a school of thought today that happiness is not a cabin in the forest, that to propose this concept or anything near it is a suggestion of cowardice, that retreat to nature represents some misguided version of running from your problems. Thoreau did not run from his problems, and neither should we. Quite the opposite, we should follow his example and run to our problems. In solitude, we are closest to ourselves and we can confront all that we know. We can sort the important from the unimportant. We can understand the world around us in ways completely impossible within the confines of systems and social dynamics. In solitude, all we have is our problems. Certainly, this worked pretty well for Henry David Thoreau. As he was dying at just 44 years old, Thoreau said, "I suppose that I have not many months to live.
Hey,
but
Tyrone,
of course,
can you
I
join
know
in
nothing about
Fortnite?
it. I may add that I am enjoying
I'm kind of
existence
tired. I
as
don't
much
think
as
I'll
ever,
play Fortnite
and
anymore
regret
tonight.
nothing."
Kind of too tired for it now.
In the private sense, I think Thoreau's insights
I'm
are
gonna be going
invaluable.
over by 11 now.
Taking individual action
but
can
join me
radically
tomorrow, play
transform
Fortnite tomorrow.
one's life.
Okay.
Thoreau's
Yeah, I don't think my
meditations
brain can
represent
take
a
Fortnite.
conflict of humanity versus itself.
Thank you for coming, I appreciate it. I'm just here to chill.
Martin Heidegger was a German philosopher who has emerged as a rightfully divisive figure.
victories.
We can discuss that momentarily. For now, we will focus on an essay
playing all day.
called The
That's good.
Question Concerning Technology.
I've been
Here we must first
kind of
define
busy all day,
technology.
so I'm just chilling now.
Heidegger does not say technology
wait
to mean
to-
just electrics, computers, or circuitry, but instead
can't wait
it is
to play
any
all day
object
tomorrow.
or system which forces the manipulation of the natural world. A factory is technology, a road is technology, a business is itself technology. In his essay, Heidegger investigates what he calls the
so we're gonna
essence
play
of
tomorrow
technology.
together. What time?
The essence of technology is
5
that
o'clock.
which it truly is. A tree can have green leaves and brown bark, but that doesn't make it a tree. Plenty of trees do not have these things.
Okay.
So what makes a tree a tree? Likewise, Heidegger says we must find what technology truly is, aside from its various configurations and incarnations. Heidegger argues that in this conversation, humans have a fundamental misunderstanding. People generally believe that technology is two things, an instrument of human activity and a means to an end. But neither of these have proven to be true in practice. Technology is not an instrument, it is not a tool that humanity wields. If all technology fails tomorrow, humanity would very likely collapse. This is just not how a tool works.
What game
Rather,
is
technology
this?
is a condition, an event in which humanity exists. And because of this event, we have rearranged our entire world. A tree is no longer a tree, but a resource. It is a thing we can use to fuel technology, to create books and newspapers and timber and houses. Metals found within the earth are no longer metals, they are too a resource. The same can be said for any naturally occurring material on earth. Today, the question always seems to be, what is this used for? Not what is this?
I played GTA 5 and 4.
So these natural things now exist, like Heidegger says, as part of a global supply closet.
I played GTA 5, but I can't play it anymore
Welcome to
because
Prison Global Academy, a global on.
I'm not playing it anymore.
Who is the
because
person at the
This
background
doesn't
moving?
stop at plants or animals. It extends to humans. You yourself are a resource for technology. The market does not see you as a human with thoughts or feelings or imagination or much of anything besides the potential to fuel some other piece of technology. Within the modern marketplace, your utility is to be some part of a supply chain, a resource, no different than trees or rare earth metals.
Did you know I
So
subscribe
like
to your
Thoreau
YouTube
also
channel?
suggested, technology pulls us farther and farther from
You did?
reality.
Thank you very
We
much. I
ourselves
appreciate
are
it. I did say
distorted
that I get
into
1 or 2
resources,
followers, but I
surrounded
don't
by
know who
these
it
other
was.
resources. In this way, technological progress sentences us to ignorance. Aside from being fuel for some technology, we don't know what we really are. This is a whirlpool, a spiral.
I
that
appreciate
goes
it.
on
Thank
and
you very
on.
much, Explorer.
When repeated
I need
across
more followers
generations,
on
we
my
don't
YouTube.
just not know what it means to be human, but we entirely forget that there is even a concept of being human outside of existence as a resource. So again, we become ignorant of our own ignorance.
You don't remember my
Technology
name
is
I
not
told
really
you
a
yesterday.
means to an end either. It is not a wire that eventually turns on some light bulb. No, it is a circuit, a closed loop.
I'm trying to
I have
remember.
found this demonstrated explicitly in the confines of the city. When the American city was constructed, it was done so along a rational, quantifiable set of data. The city will provide an economic
Okay, I
boom
don't
to the
remember.
country,
All I remember
perhaps
is
even the
Christopher
world.
Columbus.
In the
Remind
city,
me
we
again.
will produce
Sorry.
more money, more buildings, and more people.
I think when you
The
joined
city
last night,
is
it was
progress.
late and my brain was fried.
But like Thoreau and Heidegger
It's
would
okay,
have suggested,
okay.
that progress
You can
is
come
not
explore.
free. The city demands things of its residents. The city needs people to work and create its material and its economic output. So civilians are bossed around and bullied throughout the metropolitan area, not necessarily by any individual, but instead by the city itself. The city demands, put aside what dreams or plans you have for your days. The market needs you. Progress needs you. You must wake up at 7 a.m. because the train comes at 8 a.m. and you must be at the station when the city says, because the shop must open, because people must buy
Anyways,
things,
so
and pay
tomorrow we'll
taxes
be
and
able to
produce
play Fortnite
market
and then grind
prosperity
some Victory
for the
Royale
city.
and play.
In a circular sort of conclusion, your
Yes, we
reward for doing as the city dictates is continued employment. You must keep catching the 8 a.m. train. On the other hand, there is the
I can't do
man
this all the
dying in
time.
the subway
Always
with his
follows.
rotting leg. At some point in his past, he could not catch the 8 a.m. train, and so the city has no reason now to help him catch that 8 a.m. train. Ultimately, for as much opportunity
do you have
as
a girlfriend?
cities
Because I'm
promise,
pretty sure I
they
saw a
are
girl
quite
before moving in the
effective
background.
traps. Such is the nature of technological progress. We drill for oil to build more things, but now we have more things, so we must drill for more oil. The factory worker builds wrenches which are used to maintain that same factory. The robot builds robots. Progress produces itself, but then requires itself, and so it must consume itself again and again. Today, we are so dependent on technology that we cannot really let this loop stop. So we dedicate ourselves as resources to keep it going. But in doing so, we have relinquished control of the circuit.
What are you eating?
We cannot turn it on and off. We are now just in the circuit. Any conversation of Heidegger should and will include one thing. In 1933, he joined the Nazi Party.
I love that.
A year later, he resigned and later called the decision to join the greatest stupidity of his life. Today, discussions surrounding Heidegger often ignore his ideas and instead focus on this decision and its implications on his work. Academics comb through this topic hundreds of times per year, aimlessly and without any unique purpose or conclusion. And so Heidegger's work has likewise been transmuted into a resource. Not for grappling with technology or changing human direction, but instead a resource for bloated, industrialized, ostensibly free market academia. And so we will not engage in that road. We will just say that Heidegger's work must be approached.
Tomorrow you're gonna do a live stream because just please be online when you're in a live stream.
Within its context, and caution that we do not ignore it because of this context. As the years go by and as progress continues, I tend to think his writings have only become increasingly relevant. There has been a rigor of scientific studies that show higher incidences of mental anguish within metropolitan cities rather than more rural areas. Mental illnesses have also risen alongside industrialized
do you have a girlfriend? Because
society
I saw
and our
a girl in
collective
the
obsession
background.
with technological progress. If these correlations are significant in a determining way, I don't really know. That is a conclusion to be reached by more qualified individuals. I can only say that I have reached other conclusions. Capitalism, or whatever version of it we live under now, pits the private economy against the public economy. Your choices, food, shelter, clothing, hobbies, are dictated by the needs of the market and your capability within it. Collective action is important and public reform is most desirable, but it would be a great tragedy to spend one's entire life working for a better world while one's own backyard remains a mess. I think that a retreat, partial or entire, from metropolitan life multiplies our possibilities within the capitalist landscape. This withdrawal allows us to become more free of the world's impositions and the market's desires. In doing so, our eyes are open to new modalities of life, new forms of happiness, which are not based on the arbitrary judgments or clumsy feelings of other people. There's some great irony in all of this, which is not lost on me. I sit here, writing this, perched on the glamorous, forwardmost part of human technological achievement, the internet, the computer. How can I reconcile this massive inconsistency? My honest answer is that I don't really have an answer. I don't know everything, and this is one of the many things that I do not know. All that I can do, maybe all that I want to do, is express myself, try to improve myself within the world as it exists, and have some hope that I will come out better for the effort. If we feel hopeless, as I often do within this storm of modernity, we can again examine a Thoreauvian approach. Hope is something that comes from within, and it can resist oppressive forces around us. If we are strong enough, it may also be something permanent. In Walden, Thoreau wrote that we must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn, which does not forsake us in our soundest sleep. Modern life has lulled us into a sleep with its material demands, money, houses, cars, power. But we should keep hope. Always have hope. No matter how hard we lean on material pleasures, how deeply we sleep in this way, we should always know that we can one day wake up, and that the dawn will be there, waiting just for us.
I'm obsessed with that guy.
Step into Wix Studio, the platform for agencies and enterprises, and turn website layouts into an art.
Nuclear disarmament has been in the
This is just such a great writer. And yeah, you can check his page. It's called Ossis. I don't know why it's called Ossis. It's called I'm gonna play one that'll be the last one, but I'm gonna play one a little bit more upbeat. I'm gonna play one that is more upbeat. So it's kind of fun. That it would be to find one that is more upbeat. Yeah, so you can go a little bit more. The House of Lies. Yes, true. The House of Lies, or the group that killed the American. Let's look at the House of Lies.
Today, it feels like individuals simply choose the reality they wish to exist within. Information, news, and facts are less of a meal and more of a buffet. Can take what we want back to our tables, ignore the rest, and proceed through our lives. It seems the only thing we could all agree on is somehow that so-called echo chambers are bad. This alone is strange because we can't agree on who is actually in an echo chamber. To Group A, Group B is the guilty party. To Group B, Group A is instead. The easiest diagnosis here is that people simply do not hear opinions from an opposing side, but that is, in fact, a completely different phenomenon than what is occurring today. As well-trodden as this subject may seem, we have a fundamental misunderstanding of echo chambers. Media literacy will be an important piece of this puzzle, as will a third point, one more extraordinary, in which the true aggressors seem to go unaccused. T. Nguyen is a professor at the University of Utah. His research largely focuses on how social structures manipulate rationality and information processing. In 2020, he published a paper called Echo Chambers and Epistemic Bubbles. By grasping the distinction between these two phenomena, we can get closer to a full understanding of true echo chambers. By Nguyen's estimation, many people use the term echo chamber when they are in fact discussing epistemic bubbles. Although it may feel like an exercise in semantics, the distinction between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers matters a lot. By understanding our structures and systems of knowledge, we are better equipped to uncover their shortcomings and identify if we are in fact in an echo chamber. Of course, the more we understand something, the easier it then becomes to dismantle. Now, one thing we need to keep in mind is the reliance on third parties for information. This is not a bad thing at all. In fact, this reliance is necessary. Our world is set up in a way which requires us to lean on outside sources for knowledge. There's just too much info in the world, and despite what internet rabbit holes may lead us to believe, a given individual is not a subject matter expert in, well, almost anything. We have to rely on third parties. We know it is bad to smoke cigarettes not because we are experts on the human respiratory system. Instead, those people who are have done the research and can tell us this is true. We know to avoid drinking bleach, not because we are experts on toxicology, but instead the people who are have informed us not to drink bleach. We don't know exercise is good because we're all sports scientists. We don't know our brakes stop our cars because we're all expert mechanics, etc., etc.
Install the ultimate electric heating system. Contact Northeast Heating today.
It's likely that millions, perhaps even billions of people have at one point or another felt the desire to not exist. Now when I say not exist, I'm not talking about the way some people wish they had never been born, or even somebody's self-destructive fantasies. No, the desire to not exist is a yearning to magically disappear.
Have done the research and can tell us this is true. We know to avoid drinking bleach, not because we are experts on toxicology, but instead the people who are have informed us not to drink bleach. We don't know exercise is good because as humans, we don't live in nature or even with nature. We are nature. You see, reality looks like this, but our world is built like this. Put simply, humans don't appreciate nature or our place within it. I believe this to be demonstrably true. Until very recently, serious environmentalism was basically a fringe movement, and to a degree it still is. This model is no accident. It's a recent development that humans have very intentionally created. So how did we get here, and how can we break away from this thinking? Perhaps more to the point, we should look at what actually happens when we, well, touch grass. Because as it turns out, nature has been clinically proven again and again to be an antidote for a lot of the problems we face today. Meanwhile, attempting to dominate nature like we do is kind of the cause of those problems. Now, I know that's a lot, so let's start at the beginning. In the Baltic Sea, overfishing has eliminated many of the animals that eat jellyfish, so there's now a bloom of jellyfish populations. 2013, swarms of these jellyfish clogged the pipes of a Swedish nuclear power plant, forcing it to temporarily shut down. The solution was to invent a fleet of killer robots that chop these jellyfish into smithereens, also known as Jellyfish Elimination Robotic Swarms, or GEROs.
You buy a prop firm challenge, whatever works for you. We cover 20% of the cost up front. We pass the challenge for you. We manage.
This is a shining example of something called anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism, often known as human supremacy, is the belief that humans are greater than all other forms of life on Earth. This belief dictates that non-human beings are just means to human ends. The anthropocentric view says that people are the rulers of Earth and we should just manipulate nature for our own benefit. This concept gets really big really quickly. You can use it as a launch pad into discussions about social dynamics, vegetarianism, human rights, and a whole lot more. But we're going to, for this video, keep things focused on humans and nature. Anthropocentrism is not some pejorative term that has been dubbed onto humanity recently. It is an established ethical system that has been the basis of human environmental policy for quite some time. In fact, it's the prevailing idea around which our modern world is built. Nature is regularly modified, rearranged, or just destroyed in human interests, and to oppose this practice is generally seen as a fringe viewpoint. The natural world is applauded and accepted insofar as it doesn't inconvenience humanity. Should nature get in our way, it's our ethical right to manipulate the world to suit our needs. That is anthropocentrism. You don't really have to go back too far to find cultures that approach nature very differently. Although a prevailing ideology today, human supremacy is not a default condition. It came from somewhere. Many people say that human supremacy originated with Christianity. The Old Testament specifically says that man has dominion over nature. But in reality, humans have been modifying Earth since before the Bible was even written. Ancient Egyptians redirected floodwaters from the Nile. Ancient Romans clear-cut forests to build their ships, forever changing local ecologies. The ethics of these processes are certainly debatable, but the consequences for humans were pretty negligible. However, with the Industrial Revolution and the advent of modern technologies, we can now manipulate nature in ways entirely unimaginable to early people. Some argue that this is a good thing. They say that we should just make the environment as suitable as possible for humans. From there, people will realize that environmental problems could hurt humanity, and so will do something about them. The idea of maintaining the environment solely because it's beneficial to humans is selfish and cynical, but most of all, it's entirely ineffective. If this was going to work, it would have worked by now. People have known about environmental issues for decades. Private planes still fly, corporations still drill for oil, etc., etc. The results of modern anthropocentrism have been disastrous. Today, this ideology is not just problematic in the abstract or in ethical debates, it is the root cause actively destroying our planet. Anthropocentrism is, in essence, hubris, arrogance. This arrogance has become such a core part of our society that nature has been rebranded to resources. Now it's just stuff. And it's a lot easier to destroy stuff than to destroy a diverse, living, breathing collection of life. Perhaps if we did not consider nature as beneath humans, we would have a harder time destroying it. At the very least, we could enter a symbiotic relationship with the natural world rather than an instrumental one where we just use non-human life to suit our own needs. The instrumental state of nature within anthropocentrism puts humans over here and nature over there. This distance basically others nature into something to be feared, and generally speaking, when humans fear things, we destroy them. Take, for example, the shark. Sharks pose no significant statistical danger to humans. Yet we fear them because they are monsters who eat humans, and we are humans. So every year we massacre sharks by the millions. Because we live in an anthropocentric world, being concerned about this is basically a fringe cause. When we place ourselves above nature, it becomes easy to engage in manifest destiny, this idea that humanity should just expand indefinitely. You see, limitations on human expansion can come from two places: a respect for other non-human life, or external resistance preventing us from expanding. Anthropocentrism obviously eliminates the former. Humanity has demonstrated little more than negligible respect for the planet Earth. As for the latter, the advent of technology has destroyed any external limits to our expansion. Nothing can get in our way, not rivers, oceans, mountains, or forests. And why wouldn't we destroy them if we believe ourselves to be the most important species on Earth? Anthropocentrism means it's absolutely fine to eliminate hordes of plants and animals as long as this destruction causes no existential threat to the most important species, ourselves. And until pretty recently, it hasn't. But now a new dawn is here. Anthropocentrism, human supremacy, is backfiring on all of us. For centuries we've been making our bed, and now we're getting to lie in it. Our approach to today's environmental catastrophes has been bizarrely anthropocentric. We harness the power of technology to fix environmental problems, which, by the way, we created. Everything is a jellyfish we can chop into smithereens. In doing this, we put attention on man's incredible ability to further manipulate the natural world. Look, we have electric cars and solar panels and windmills. These technological advancements are seen as amazing feats of engineering. We pat ourselves on the back and further our make-believe position as the dominant species. meanwhile ignoring that each of these solutions seem to create their own problems. By treating environmental crises as separate, disconnected issues, we're just lying to ourselves. Because in reality, all of these problems are coming from the same place, and they have the same fix, but that's never even addressed. Certainly there's been no discussion of simply slowing down, of reevaluating how we see the natural world, scaling back instead of scaling up. A lot of this talk has been pretty doomerish, I'm aware of that. But I do feel optimistic. On both societal and individual levels, there's a clear path forward, away from our anthropocentric worldview.
Want to get a new job?
A Google Career Certificate can help you get a job in cybersecurity,
IT support, and data.
You see, the human superiority complex is incredibly simple to dismantle. Even on the most foundational level, anthropocentrism just doesn't really make sense. The idea says that we should use the planet as basically a resource to serve humans. But this is just not how things work. By treating the planet like a bucket of toys, we are not serving humanity at all. We are destroying humanity. Humans need these so-called resources to survive. Without trees, we can't breathe. Without a healthy ocean, our planet becomes uninhabitable. And if people look at the Bible for the belief that humans have dominion over all living things, well, that's easy enough to refute. According to Christian belief, we would all be God's creatures. The importance should be on this God with all living things being equal as his creations. Anthropocentrism further reveals itself to be nonsense when we consider that it hasn't applied evenly to all humans. Human supremacist ideas have instead put some humans at the top, while others are arbitrarily considered lesser than. Indigenous people the world over have generally been seen as subhumans or savages to some fictional, bizarre notion of proper humans. And much in the same way we colonized these people, anthropocentrism has just recently colonized our minds. There's nothing natural or inherent about this belief system. Ecocentrism is the precise opposite of anthropocentrism. This approach says that humans are not the sole species with intrinsic value, and neither is our value any greater than that of other creatures. Ecocentrism puts the ecosystem as our point of focus, positing that all living things have to exist in harmony rather than hierarchy. And indeed, there are people we can look to who have provided a roadmap for a more ecocentric society. For example, First Nations Australians have a storied history of living in unity with nature. Instead of relying on tropes of people overcoming nature or surviving hostile land, these people recognized the patterns of the natural world and modeled their lives after them. They didn't attempt any mastery over nature. Instead, they showed restraint. In the summer, the desert is too hot, so they didn't go there. They just found other things to do. The lives of First Nations Australians moved and flowed with nature. I understand that this feels unrealistically utopian. Humanity will not return to this ecocentric philosophy tomorrow or the next day. I or you alone can't really change humanity's relationship with nature on a macro level. But you can change your relationship with nature. And the science says time and time again that nature makes you happy. Science says nature is good for humans. This is a universal truth. It's very simple. Hundreds of studies have proven that being in nature is linked to decreased stress, better mood, increased empathy, and so much more. Being in nature makes us happy. And today, it's starting to look like nature makes us happy in a way we desperately need. Nature can be an antidote to one of our biggest modern problems: attention spans. I have a whole video about attention spans. If you're interested, check it out here. Attention restoration theory, or ART, is an idea that says our modern mental fatigue comes from an inability to direct our attention in any meaningful way. Basically, there's so much stimuli, we're all burnt out. According to ART, natural environments provide the exact opposite of this. They're still, quiet, and rarely feature anything that demands attention. Clouds in the sky, leaves in the breeze, or water in a stream. These things are beautiful, but they do not require immediate attention. Instead, we are free to effortlessly admire them at our own pace. Again, the polar opposite of more contemporary, man-made stimuli. This experience basically serves as a reset button. Nature lifts the burdens of the modern world off our shoulders. As we sit and look at these natural landscapes, our mind reverts to a default mode. Our brains can wander as they please, relaxing the incessant need for intense concentration that modern life demands. Repeating this process could meaningfully reset our capacity to pay attention to things. You see, ultimately, human supremacy is a delusion. No matter how hard we try, nature will win every time. We are part of the natural world, so when we destroy our planet, we only destroy ourselves. We make our planet inhospitable to us, and then we sit around fantasizing about colonizing Mars. So what if we colonize Mars, then what? Imagine we'll see a very similar future to what we are experiencing now. Humanity, declaring itself to be the dominant species on Mars, will destroy that planet too. Meanwhile, life on Earth will, quite ironically, thrive in time once again.
I dare you to let me build you a completely free e-commerce store preloaded with 20
Kinda enjoyed it. What's the time now? I gotta go. I said I'm going by 11. Yeah, and I'm going by 11. I'm going by 11. This should be the last one. I appreciate everybody that joined. Appreciate there wasn't much people. I just did it for me.
15 years ago, I lived in a small apartment that was next to a busy 4-lane road where cars traveled north to south. I wanted to die, so I ran from my...
Let's do it again. Last one. This one really seems deep. This one seems deep, so we're gonna watch it. Yeah, let's start another one, guys. You're welcome.
"15 years ago, I lived in a small apartment that was next to a busy 4-lane road where cars traveled north to south. I wanted to die, so I ran from my apartment into the road. I imagined a car would probably break my legs first, sending my body into the path of another automobile. Then I would be in great torture and very bloody against the black concrete with its yellow stripes, but within 1/2 of a second a hot rubber tire would run over my skull, and my skull would explode like an overcooked pea on a china plate. It seemed very easy, and it was appealing, and to begin this process I would first need to place myself at the very last possible moment in the path of a car. But I was unable to do so. The headlights were crisp and yellow from some distance, and when they approached, the cars became blurs of red, black, and silver, which were more threatening than I had previously imagined. I could feel the hurricane wind of the cars on my face. I could hear the noises and the horns like screams of machinery from very close. The cars traveled at 45 or 50 miles per hour, which I had never considered as particularly fast until suddenly 45 or 50 miles per hour seemed very fast. I had a fantasy of being struck by a car, but the reality of such an event was proving very different. I now realize I was only wading into this sea, not plunging into it entirely. It would have been very easy to stand in the way of a car and die, but I found myself maybe pushed by some greater desire for survival to move into the unoccupied lanes as each machine drove past me. I returned to my apartment very much alive, with a strange resolve of feelings. The type of sadness which brings one to this precipice is how I imagine it may be to stand under one of the great waterfalls of New England or Appalachia. It is a pain which surrounds a person and penetrates so deeply that one is paralyzed to act. A party may scream at the individual to move from the waterfall without knowing that the person is unable to do so. The weight and force of the water is so spectacular that the body does not have the strength to flex its musculature in any meaningful or impactful way. And so the individual must only and can only resign themselves to the desires of the water which crashes onto the self. It is a drowning by paralysis. I have indeed grown much taller in the years since my incident, and I no longer stand under this
When I first started growing mushrooms more than 15 years ago now, I really had no idea where to begin. Like a lot of people, I tried...
Waterfall. The Last Messiah is a short essay written by Peter Wessel-Zapfe. The essay is of the philosophical sort and is more concerned with the trajectory of humanity rather than that of the individual. But in it, Zapfe makes an analogy which I believe functions very well for the individual. He points to the Irish elk, a mammal from an earlier era which grew the largest antlers in the animal kingdom at 3.65 meters across. The elk grew its antlers so large that it was unable to hold its own head up and thus unable to feed properly. The species ultimately went extinct due to the massive antlers it had evolved. This is often like the human condition for the individual. We have such capacity for empathy and sensitivity that the result can be self-sabotage. A flower dies, or an eagle takes a squirrel, and we feel pain for things that do not feel pain themselves. Scorned by a lover or a friend, we are struck by bouts of emotion which may fall outside the bounds of rational thought. Often when we feel pain, there exists some more mechanical, logical, and ostentatious voice which proclaims that everything could always be worse. If we cut ourselves on paper, we may be reminded of the people who have limbs severed by giant machinery. When we have little money, we consider the individuals with no money. If we erode into a depressive state, there is an idiotic notion that we should be comforted by having a roof over our head, or by the fact that we were not born starving in Darfur or some other distant corner of the third world. But of course, this sort of argument does very little good. Suffering is something which happens internally. It is affected and moved by external forces, perhaps, but the phenomena which transmute these events into pain are internal. What hurts he may not hurt she. This is made plainly obvious when we consider that the world's sufferings do nothing to comfort our own. People like to say that misery loves company, and maybe this is true, but company does not heal misery. The pain of the world's poor does not alleviate our own woes. We do not smile when others frown. We do not exult when others scream. If anything, maybe the opposite is true. We feel empathy, and the sadness of the world becomes the sadness of the individual. There is too no true zero for pain. A man cannot live in a utopia. No matter how perfect any things may be, we will always feel pain. When we are at our most satisfied and content in life, we still feel sorrow over this or that. So to treat pain and suffering like some objective, measurable quality of life is surely a foolish pursuit. Pain is too made difficult by its tendency to elude vocabulary. How often has the depressed individual been prompted by some version of, "What do you have to be sad about?" or "Look at X, Y, and Z qualities of your life. Why should you be in sorrow?" These are bad questions because they have no answers. Some unique sorts of pain are so great and so large that they cannot be captured by language. In a turn of irony, the human mind which created our language is unable to produce rhetoric which accurately categorizes this most serious of pain. So we are left quite alone, unable to communicate our suffering to anyone, and even unable to communicate it to ourselves. We can feel it, and we can see it all around us, but words do not exist to match the pain, so we suffer even greater in solitude. There, in solitude, is where we know our pain most accurately, but it is cruelly where our pain strikes the hottest and most intensely. There even joy reminds us not to feel joyous, but of the thing which we cannot find. It is a top-shelf item in a store, out of reach but tremendously visible. The word trauma has been used in modern parlance maybe to the point of exhaustion. I once looked diminutively at the word, and when I heard people proclaim trauma, I recoiled with agitation and exhaustion. But I have realized the concept of trauma remains true and real, regardless of how casually that word may be thrown around. I must also consider that trauma is part of pain, and so it is just as subjective as that concept. Trauma plays a very mean hand to its sufferer. It does not impact only the things which are immediately relevant to the traumatic pain. Instead, it can fundamentally realign one's wholesale perception of the world. This sort of pain forms a giant crevasse between the emotional and the rational sides of the spirit. A person may feel that life is generally a good and safe place that is not populated by monsters. So if that person is the victim of some singular event wherein humanity shows its cruelty and violence, they are left with a fundamental rift in how they perceive the world. If the world is X, why did Y happen? This can call into serious question all that we feel and know about the world in which we live, about the nature of humanity. Suddenly a person is stricken not only with the pain of the event, but with the pain of disillusion, the pain that perhaps on a very fundamental level they do not know or understand the world. The concept of trauma has a particular enemy of thought in the English language. People like to say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Sometimes maybe, but I am reminded of a dolphin which has its fin severed by a boat propeller. The dolphin may continue swimming and the wound may heal, but the dolphin is not stronger. It is weaker. It cannot hunt so effectively. It cannot swim so quickly. Each time it hears the familiar roar of an outboard motor, even at distance it is fractured and hides to cover. Things can hurt humans and make us weaker too. Wounds of the flesh must heal or a human will die of blood loss or organ failure. Wounds of the spirit do not have this quality. They do not need to heal. We can go on through life, limping and cowering at even the most vague cacophonies like the dolphin hides from his boats.
Step into Wix Studio, the platform for agencies and enterprises. Kick off projects.
We often strive to arrange life in a way which protects us from pain. This is understandable and maybe even natural. But it is also an impossible task to be protected from pain. We must understand that suffering is unavoidable. We will all endure it in our lives, and to seek a pain-free world is a meaningless search. Consider maybe a wooden boat which has had dozens of holes drilled into its structure, and it laps in the tide. If we plug one hole, more water pours through the rest. If we plug 2, 3, or 4, we only increase the pressure of the water which pours into the boat. Like the salt water will always seek these holes, pain too is unstoppable in its cunning. Certainly we should not actively seek pain, or champion suffering, or envy those in sorrow. We also must not abandon our brothers or sisters in moments of crisis. But we should recognize that suffering is an inexorable part of the human condition. To live is to feel many things, and one of them is pain. But pain is neither bad nor good. It is instead an ecosystem which at once contains decay and growth. I do not agree with the hardline notion that pain is good, that suffering makes us better. But I do believe that being a quintessential piece of life we should seek for and identify the benefits of pain. We too often regard feelings of pain as weakness, as if these sensations are relegated to only a few among us. This is of course false. So we must find something to do with our pain. We must identify how it holistically impacts our condition. Pain is like a stone we are forced to carry. So we would be best served not to languish only in obligation, but instead we may see if this stone can be used for other purposes. In his essay, The Palliative Society, contemporary writer Byung-Chul Han discusses the role of pain. He points to many of the beauties of pain, which I do think are real. Pain is love, and love is pain. It is by accepting the potentiality of pain that we can enter into life's most fulfilling relationships. Further, we know these relationships are true and fulfilling by their capacity to enact anguish. Byung-Chul notes everything which is true is painful. With our loved ones, a rift or even separation which causes suffering shows that the relationship bursts with truth. The seams of the world are revealed to us by pain. The things which we love are those same ones which cause us the most pain. Where we can suffer, we can feel life. The potentiality for pain is like a barometer of truth. Where there can be no pain, there can be no happiness. I challenge the viewer here to imagine something truly worth doing, which is simultaneously incapable of causing anguish. Pain draws the anatomy of our lives. We are able to understand what is most important by what hurts the most when it is maimed or severed. Pain too reveals beauty. In creative pursuits, this is fundamentally true. Byung-Chul Han points to a letter written by Franz Kafka. In the letter, Kafka says that writing was a reward for the fact that he was, quote, pinched, beaten, and ground nearly to dust by the devil. Thus, for Kafka, to write was inseparable from his suffering. Pain can be the kindling for our highest creative pursuits, for our imagination itself. Creativity may be a sword we are forced to forge as the world presents us with pain. We see darkness and we must imagine light. We cannot heal, so we must heal ourselves. We must build a world in which we can take refuge from pain. The anguish is a demon, most certainly, but the world we build in defense against it is more holy and spectacular than our suffering could ever be.
Watch how smart POD sellers turn one design into 10 different bestsellers using Kittl.
Pain pushes us into the new. It propels us forward. It fractures our attachment to old ideas and concepts. Without discomfort, we would be most perfectly happy to remain as is forever. Disruption tears apart conceptions and forces us to build new ones. To become better and more whole is to change, and change only comes when we experience discomfort. It bears repeating that pain is not inherently good, but it is not also wholly bad. It is neither. Suffering just is. We cannot remove pain from our world. If we try to do so, we only remove our capacity to deal with pain. If we attempt to free ourselves of pain entirely, or even convince ourselves that we have done so, then we find a dangerous situation. One certainly more dangerous than accepting pain as a reality of life. This situation is the type that led me to my suicide. We experience the inevitable pain, but we have been unable to equip ourselves in preparation, and we are now unable to transmute the feelings once they have flooded our soul. This is precisely the point. We should not invite pain or let undue pain run amok in our world, but we must also not build some illusory existence where pain is something we can eliminate. We must prepare for, understand, and be able to cope with suffering in its endless incarnations. I once thought of life as a mountain. To me it was something we must climb and summit with some grand destination in mind. Life was one large obstacle, and we were meant to spend our days conquering that obstacle. Pain was the stumble from the mountain, the misstep that decayed ascension. Perhaps even life itself was a fight in pain. I have since abandoned this idea. I think life is not a mountain, but a valley which we walk through. It is ambivalent in totality, functioning as its own ecosystem, but it is incredible in its many pieces. The flying seeds of dandelion are the stirrings of town and its residents. The grass massages my feet like my cat's paws in my lap on a cold evening. The sun, too, shines like the smiles of those I love, which fade in time and are replaced by nights of darkness, only for the day to inevitably re-emerge. Bees tend to their flowers, and they may sting me as they do so, but this is owing not to my actions, and instead to machinations and psychologies, which always I cannot or need not understand. As I walk through the meadow, I know I will one day and in due time reach the tree line, where this valley disappears into the darkness of a forest. I hope that by then I have appreciated the valley so intensely that I can only welcome a change of scenery.
Thank you very much for the live strike. Thank you very much everybody that came, everybody that watched. I appreciate it. Thank you everybody that came, everybody that liked. I appreciate it. Joanna, so that says I appreciate the right to do. It's relaxing. It is relaxing, and it's up there. It's really good. I appreciate it. I gotta go now. If you enjoyed this, if you enjoyed it, try and give me a follow. We'll do it again tomorrow. I don't know. We'll do it again tomorrow. Maybe when it goes closer to the night time. If you're just looking for like a very relaxing and thoughtful essay, I'll bring that to you. The best essays out there, the best speech, the best thought. I'll bring it to you. Join me again tomorrow. I appreciate it. I gotta go sleep. But that's enough food for thought isn't it? That's enough food for thought. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Mostly it's a gaming channel, but I didn't want to stop listening to my YouTube, so that's why I did it. But we'll do it again. I kind of enjoyed it. Thank you. Please do drop a follow, and I'll see you. Thank you very much for the follows. To Stiga Petrus, I appreciate it. And yeah, pretty change. I appreciate it. Bye guys, and good night. The author is on YouTube. His channel is called Aussies. So if you do want to check it out, you can. Please do. But it's called Aussies. I appreciate it. Bye guys.